There is a kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot fix. You wake up tired, you work tired, you answer messages tired, you complete the things that need to be completed, and somehow you keep going. From the outside, nothing may appear to be wrong. You are still functioning, but somewhere inside, something has begun to grow cold. At first, you barely notice it. You lose interest in things that once mattered. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Rest feels strangely undeserved. Even moments that should bring pleasure seem unable to reach you. So you do what many people do. You keep moving. You tell yourself that next week will be easier, that after this project, this deadline, this responsibility, you will finally have time to breathe. But the next week comes, and there is always something else. This is where the story of the little match girl begins to speak to the modern experience of burnout. Not because the girl and the exhausted adult live the same life. They do not. Her world is one of literal cold, poverty, hunger, and abandonment. Ours may be filled with heated rooms, full refrigerators, digital connections, and endless possibilities. And yet, psychologically, there can be a strange similarity. Both can know what it means to remain exposed to a world that keeps demanding something while offering very little warmth in return. The little girl walks through the winter night carrying a bundle of matches. Each one is small, almost insignificant. And yet, when she lights one, something changes. For a brief moment, there is warmth. There is light. There is an image of something she longs for. The flame does not last, but she lights another, and another. And perhaps this is where the fairy tale becomes unsettling, because sometimes we do the same thing. We live from small flames. A compliment, a successful day, a distraction, a weekend, a new achievement, a few hours of entertainment, something that gives us just enough light to continue into another day. But a flame can illuminate darkness without warming the whole room. And when we depend on increasingly smaller flames to sustain an increasingly exhausted life, something inside us begins to change. The question is no longer simply, how much can we endure? It becomes something more difficult. What happens when endurance itself becomes the way we live? Because the coldest part of burnout may not be the moment when the body finally stops. It may be the moment when we stop noticing that we are cold. And this is where the wounded child enters the story. There is a part of us that does not grow older in quite the same way the rest of us does. We may become more capable, more responsible, more disciplined. We learn how to pay the bills, answer the emails, solve problems, meet expectations. But somewhere beneath all of that, there can remain a much more vulnerable part of the psyche, a part that still remembers what it felt like to need warmth and not receive it. This is the image of the wounded child. Not necessarily the memory of one particular event. Sometimes the wound is quieter than that. It can be the repeated experience of having to be strong too early, of learning that your needs were inconvenient, that exhaustion was something to hide, that asking for help meant becoming a burden, that being useful was safer than being vulnerable. So the child adapts, and eventually, the child becomes an adult who knows how to function remarkably well. This is one of the strange paradoxes of psychological suffering. The person who appears the most capable may have learned capability as a form of survival. They do not collapse because they have become experts at continuing. They anticipate, they organize, they take responsibility. They carry what others cannot. And for a while, this adaptation works, until it doesn't. The little match girl has no one coming to rescue her from the cold. There is no warm house waiting for her at the end of the street. No one asks what she needs. No one notices what the cold is doing to her. So she turns to the only thing she possesses, her matches. And this is where the image becomes psychologically powerful. The wounded part of us often learns to create its own small sources of comfort. A little achievement, a little praise, a little control, a little distraction. Just enough to make the next hour bearable. The problem is that survival strategies can become identities. The person who once learned to be strong begins to believe they must always be strong. The person who learned not to need anything begins to feel ashamed of needing anything. The person who survived by giving becomes frightened of receiving. And eventually, the question is no longer whether this person is tired. Of course they are tired. The deeper question is, what happens when the part of you that has been surviving is never allowed to rest? This is why burnout can feel strangely empty. The body may be exhausted, but beneath the physical exhaustion, there can be something more difficult to name. A quiet grief, a loss of desire, the feeling that you have spent years becoming good at carrying life without ever asking whether life is carrying you back. The wounded child does not ask for a perfect life. It asks for something much simpler. Warmth, attention, safety, the permission to exist without constantly proving its worth. And perhaps this is why the little girl keeps lighting the matches. She is not simply trying to escape the cold. She is trying to find evidence that warmth still exists. But every flame disappears. And when a person has learned to survive on small flames, there comes a moment when even those flames begin to cost too much. That is when the matches become more than a source of light. They become a measure of how much life we still have left to give. And the next question becomes unavoidable. What are we burning inside ourselves just to keep going? The little girl strikes another match. For a few seconds, the darkness changes. The cold is still there. The night has not disappeared, but the flame creates a small space in which another reality becomes possible. This is what makes the image of the match so haunting. It does not remove the darkness. It only gives us enough light to keep going. And perhaps this is how many exhausted people live. Not with a great source of inner warmth, but with a collection of small flames. A message that makes us feel seen. A compliment after weeks of doubt. A successful project. A weekend away. A few hours alone. Another achievement. Another distraction. Another promise that things will feel different after we finish whatever is currently demanding our attention. Each flame helps. For a moment. And then it disappears. So we strike another. The danger is not that these things are meaningless. They are meaningful. The danger is believing they can sustain an entire life when they were never meant to carry that weight. A promotion can bring satisfaction. Recognition can feel nourishing. Entertainment can offer relief. Achievement can restore confidence. But none of them can permanently replace the deeper experiences from which psychological life draws its warmth. Connection, meaning, beauty, rest, belonging, the freedom to feel something without immediately turning it into a task. The little girl does not light her matches because she is foolish. She lights them because she is cold. And this distinction matters. Many of the things we criticize in ourselves are attempts to survive something we have not yet understood. Overworking may be an attempt to feel valuable. Constant productivity may be an attempt to avoid emptiness. Endless distraction may be an attempt to escape an inner silence that has become frightening. Even achievement can become a match, something we strike whenever the darkness becomes too uncomfortable. But every match has a cost. It burns because something is being consumed. And this is where the metaphor becomes unsettling. What if some of the things keeping us functional are also consuming the very energy we need to feel alive? We may continue moving, continue achieving, continue answering, continue producing, yet the flames become shorter, the warmth becomes weaker, and eventually we may discover that we have become extraordinarily skilled at keeping ourselves going without asking what we are actually going toward, because a match can help us survive another moment, but it was never meant to become the sun. At first, survival is supposed to be temporary. You endure the difficult season. You finish the impossible project. You get through the crisis. You tell yourself that eventually, life will become lighter. But sometimes the crisis never really ends. It simply becomes normal. And this is where survival changes its meaning. You stop asking whether you are exhausted because exhaustion has become part of your identity. You wake up tired, but you call it discipline. You have no time for yourself, but you call it responsibility. You feel emotionally empty, but you call it maturity. You keep moving because stopping would force you to notice what has been happening inside. The little match girl lives in a world where survival is immediate. She needs warmth because the cold is real. She needs food because she is hungry. She needs shelter because she has nowhere to go. But the modern exhausted person can experience a psychological version of the same condition without recognizing it. The danger is not always that life is unbearable. Sometimes the danger is that life becomes bearable enough to continue indefinitely. Just enough energy to work. Just enough motivation to finish. Just enough pleasure to recover. Just enough distraction to avoid the silence. Then another day begins, and another. The person becomes highly functional while becoming increasingly disconnected from what once made life meaningful. This is the paradox of burnout. The body may eventually demand a stop, but long before that, the inner life may have already begun withdrawing. Curiosity becomes quieter. Desire becomes harder to feel. Beauty passes unnoticed. Relationships become obligations. Rest becomes another task to optimize. And somewhere underneath all of this, the wounded child is still waiting. Not for another achievement, not for another deadline to disappear, but for warmth. For someone to notice that surviving is not the same as living. This is why the story becomes darker when we look at it through the symbol of the matches. The girl keeps lighting them because each flame gives her something the world is withholding. For the exhausted adult, the matches may look different. Work can become a match. Success can become a match. Approval can become a match. Even constant activity can become a match, because silence might reveal the emptiness underneath. But eventually, the question becomes impossible to avoid. What happens when we have spent so much of ourselves keeping the fire alive that there is almost nothing left to burn? That is the point where exhaustion stops being merely physical. It becomes a message from somewhere deeper, and perhaps the soul is not asking us to become stronger. Perhaps it is asking us to finally notice what has been left in the cold. The little girl lights another match, and once again, the darkness changes. But now, we can look at the flame differently. Perhaps what she sees is not simply an escape from suffering. Perhaps each vision reveals something her soul has been deprived of. Warmth, food, beauty, home, belonging. The things she sees are not random. They are images of what she is hungry for. And this is where the story becomes painfully familiar. Because exhaustion can hide hunger. Not the hunger of the body, but the hunger of the inner life. We can be surrounded by food and still feel starved for meaning. Surrounded by people and still feel unseen. Successful and still feel empty. Busy and still feel that something essential is missing. The modern world is very good at measuring what we produce. It is much less interested in asking what nourishes us. So we learn to measure our days by tasks completed. Emails answered, meetings attended, goals reached, problems solved. But the soul does not live by productivity alone. It needs experiences that cannot always be measured. A sense of belonging, a moment of beauty, a relationship in which we do not have to perform, silence that does not feel threatening, rest that does not have to be earned, and perhaps most importantly, the feeling that our existence has value beyond what we accomplish. This is where the wounded child becomes visible again. The wounded part of us may not know how to ask for these things directly. Instead, it may speak through exhaustion, through irritability, through numbness, through the strange feeling that nothing is wrong and yet nothing feels alive. We may interpret these signals as weakness, but perhaps they are messages. Perhaps something inside us has been hungry for a very long time. The little girl keeps lighting matches because each flame briefly gives form to what she cannot otherwise have. The fire shows her what she longs for, and perhaps our own small flames do something similar. The things we repeatedly seek may reveal what we have been missing. What do we reach for when we are exhausted? What makes us feel briefly alive? What do we keep pursuing, even when the satisfaction never lasts? These questions can become uncomfortable because sometimes the answer reveals that we have been using achievement to compensate for belonging, distraction to compensate for rest, recognition to compensate for self-worth, productivity to compensate for meaning. And once we see that, burnout begins to look different. It is no longer simply a body demanding a break. It may be a life asking a question. What have you been starving while trying so hard to survive? Perhaps the deepest form of exhaustion begins when we keep feeding everything except the part of us that needs to feel alive. Perhaps the lesson of the little match is not that we need more light. Perhaps it is that we need to understand what kind of warmth we have been living without. The girl in the story keeps striking matches because the world around her has become unbearably cold, and each flame reveals something: a table filled with food, a warm room, a beautiful tree, the presence of someone she longs for. For a few moments, she is connected to something that feels alive. Then the flame disappears, but what it revealed remains. And perhaps this is what our own exhaustion can sometimes reveal. Not simply that we need to stop, but that something inside us has been neglected for too long. The answer is not to abandon responsibility. It is not to escape every demand. And it is not to turn rest into another achievement. The deeper task is to remember that a human being cannot live entirely from external demands. There must also be an inner source, a place where curiosity can exist without becoming productivity, where relationships are more than obligations, where beauty does not need a purpose, where silence is not something to fill, where vulnerability is not treated as failure. This is where the wounded child can begin to change. Not because the past disappears, not because every wound is suddenly healed, but because the vulnerable part of us is no longer forced to survive in complete isolation. We begin to notice it. We begin to listen. And perhaps that is the beginning of psychological warmth. The little girl had only a handful of matches. We often have much more at our disposal. Yet we can still live as though we are standing outside in the cold, striking one small flame after another, just to make it through the night. The difference is that we can learn to ask what the flames are trying to show us. What are we hungry for? What have we abandoned? What once made us feel alive? What part of our existence has become nothing more than another obligation? These questions do not offer instant answers. They offer something more valuable: awareness. Because exhaustion becomes dangerous when we stop listening to what it is trying to tell us. The inner fire does not demand constant intensity. It needs attention. It needs nourishment. It needs space. And sometimes, protecting that fire means admitting that the life we have become very good at maintaining is not necessarily the life our soul is asking us to live. Burnout may tell us that we have reached our limit, but beneath that limit, there may be another message, a quieter one, not work harder, not even stop everything, but there is still something alive inside you. Do not leave it in the cold. And perhaps that is where the story of the little match girl finally turns into our own. Because the real question is not how many matches we have left. It is whether we have remembered what the fire was meant to warm. Maybe burnout is not always a sign that we have done too much. Sometimes it is a sign that something inside us has been given too little. Too little rest, too little meaning, too little beauty, too little connection, too little space to simply be. The little match girl reminds us of something uncomfortable. A person can survive for a long time on very little warmth, but survival is not the same as being alive. So before you ask yourself how much more you can endure, perhaps ask a different question. What inside me is still waiting to be nourished? Because the inner fire does not need to become a raging flame. It only needs to remain alive. If this story made you recognize something in your own life, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to explore more stories through the hidden language of the psyche, subscribe to Unconscious Wisdom. there are ancient stories that still know something about us. Sometimes they are simply waiting for us to look again. And perhaps the smallest flame is enough to show us where the darkness begins.